August 26, 1914. The sun sets over the battlefields of East Prussia, casting a warm glow on the chaos below. You've just woken up to find yourself in the midst of a pivotal moment in history, one that will forever alter the course of the war. The air is thick with tension as the Germans, confident in their strategic prowess, are about to face an unexpected setback. Enter the Battle of Tannenberg, a battle that, quite literally, shattered Russian morale in the blink of an eye. But wait, before we get to the bloody, devastating clash that follows, let's take a moment to think, what would it be like to wake up in a world where your country's fate is in the hands of soldiers thousands of miles away? Can you imagine being in the middle of a battle that will change everything? Well, that's where we begin today. But first, grab your favorite blanket, dim the lights, and let the sounds of history take you on a journey to Tannenberg. The year is 1914. The Russians, brimming with confidence, march into East Prussia, believing their numbers and determination will quickly overwhelm the Germans. Little did they know, a fateful encounter was about to unfold, one that would cripple their morale and change the course of the war forever. The Russian generals were sure that their numerical superiority would be enough to defeat the Germans, but the reality of the situation was about to shatter their illusions. In the early months of 1914, Russia's military optimism was at an all-time high. They had long believed that their vast population and extensive resources would give them a decisive edge in the war. With over 1.5 million men mobilized by the summer of 1914, Russia's military commanders were convinced that they could overwhelm the Germans through sheer numbers. The Russian army, though poorly trained and equipped in comparison to the German forces, was determined to push forward and assert dominance on the Eastern Front. Their initial focus was on invading East Prussia, a key territory held by Germany. The Russians, under the command of Grand Duke Nicholas, hoped to cripple the Germans early in the war, making them fight a two-front battle against both France and Russia. The Russian forces confidently crossed the border into East Prussia, and their commanders believed that their strength in numbers would easily secure victory. The plan was straightforward: advance rapidly, crush the Germans in a quick battle, and drive them back, creating a psychological blow that would destabilize their morale. But the reality of war quickly set in. The Russian forces had underestimated the Germans in almost every way, especially in terms of their efficiency, organization, and tactical skill. One of the primary miscalculations made by the Russians was in their underestimation of German speed and mobility. The German generals, led by General Helmuth von Moltke, the Younger, had been preparing for a long conflict and had refined their tactics over years of experience. The Germans knew how to strike fast and decisively, and they quickly realized that a drawn-out war on the Eastern Front would be disastrous for them. Instead of allowing the Russians to settle into a comfortable advance, the Germans employed superior tactics and made swift counterattacks, throwing off the Russian plan and forcing them into a defensive position. The first major battle between the two armies took place at Tannenberg, a small village in East Prussia. The Russian commanders, overly confident in their strategic advantage, were unaware of the German plans to isolate and destroy their forces. The Germans, using advanced communication and tactical coordination, surrounded the Russian Second Army. Despite being outnumbered, the Germans used their speed, surprise, and precision to devastating effect. They encircled the Russians, cutting off their supply lines and forcing them into retreat. The Battle of Tannenberg was a decisive German victory. The Russians, overwhelmed and surrounded, suffered catastrophic losses. Over 92,000 Russian soldiers were captured, and tens of thousands more were killed or wounded. The Russians, who had begun the war with such confidence, were now left reeling. Their commanders, who had believed that a decisive victory was imminent, were left scrambling to regroup their forces. The shock of Tannenberg shattered Russian morale. The once confident Russian generals, who had relied on their numerical superiority, now had to contend with the crushing reality that they could not defeat the Germans through force of numbers alone. The battle revealed significant flaws in Russia's military organization, including poor leadership, outdated tactics, and inefficient communication. For the Russian soldiers, the defeat at Tannenberg was a humiliating blow. The perception that their army was unstoppable was crushed, and doubts about their ability to win the war began to grow. The Germans, on the other hand, had proved their ability to overcome the odds, and their victory at Tannenberg cemented their status as the dominant force on the Eastern Front. In the aftermath of Tannenberg, Russia's hope for a swift victory in the war evaporated. The shockwaves of the defeat were felt across the Russian Empire, and the failure to properly assess the military strength of Germany would haunt Russia for the remainder of the war. The once confident Russian offensive had been thwarted, and the war in the East was about to become a long and brutal struggle, one that would test not only the military resilience of Russia, but also the strength of its leadership and resolve. The Battle of Tannenberg marked the moment when Russia's initial dreams of victory were dashed, and the reality of the conflict began to set in. Behind every great military victory is a brilliant mind, and at Tannenberg, those minds belonged to General Paul von Hindenburg and his right-hand man, Erich Ludendorff. Together, they executed a counteroffensive that not only outsmarted the Russians, but outflanked them in ways they never saw coming. In this segment, we dive into the tactical brilliance of these two figures, who turned the tide of the battle and forever cemented their legacy in the annals of military history. The German victory at the Battle of Tannenberg was not just a product of superior weaponry or overwhelming numbers. It was the result of brilliant strategic minds executing a carefully coordinated plan that caught the Russian forces completely off guard. The men behind this remarkable victory were General Paul von Hindenburg and his deputy, Erich Ludendorff. These two men would go on to become legends in their own right, not just for their success at Tannenberg, but for their ability to turn the tide of war through sheer tactical ingenuity. General Hindenburg, at the time, was a seasoned military leader with extensive experience in both combat and leadership. His career had seen several high points, but it was the Battle of Tannenberg that brought him to the forefront of German military leadership. Hindenburg's ability to remain calm under pressure, coupled with his exceptional strategic insight, made him an ideal leader in this critical moment. His approach was rooted in methodical planning and deep respect for the power of defensive strategy. Hindenburg's right-hand man, Erich Ludendorff, played a crucial role in the planning and execution of the battle. Ludendorff was a master tactician, known for his attention to detail and ability to think several steps ahead of the enemy. Unlike many commanders who relied on traditional offensive tactics, Ludendorff understood that victory was often achieved not by brute force, but by exploiting the enemy's weaknesses. Immense challenge at Tannenberg. While they had the advantage in numbers and firepower, they were far from being in a position to overrun the Russian forces easily. Ludendorff's genius lay in his ability to foresee how the Russians might overextend themselves and how he could use their own vulnerabilities against them. Together, Hindenburg and Ludendorff orchestrated a brilliant counteroffensive that struck at the heart of the Russian position. The Russian Second Army, under the command of General Alexander Samsonov, had advanced too far into East Prussia, outflanking themselves and leaving their supply lines exposed. Hindenburg and Ludendorff exploited this weakness with precision. Their forces executed a rapid encirclement of the Russian troops, effectively cutting off their escape routes and trapping them within a deadly vice. The battle was not just one of firepower. It was one of maneuver and anticipation, where the Germans used the landscape and the enemy's own momentum against them. What set Hindenburg and Ludendorff apart was their ability to adapt quickly and make decisions in the heat of battle. While the Russians were bogged down in confusion and disarray, the German commanders were able to keep their forces tightly coordinated. attacking the Russian flanks while maintaining pressure on the retreating center. This relentless assault broke the Russian resolve and ultimately led to the surrender of the Second Army. More than 90,000 Russian soldiers were captured, and tens of thousands more were killed or wounded, making it one of the most decisive defeats for Russia in the early stages of the war. The success at Tannenberg propelled both Hindenburg and Ludendorff to the status of national heroes in Germany. Their victory was not only a military triumph but a symbol of the German army's resilience and tactical superiority. In the aftermath, the German Empire celebrated their strategic brilliance, and the two men were hailed as the architects of the victory that would serve as a cornerstone of German morale for years to come. The legacy of Hindenburg and Ludendorff continued to grow throughout World War I. The Battle of Tannenberg marked the beginning of their ascent to power, and their partnership would shape the course of the war. Their combined leadership brought Germany much-needed victories on the Eastern Front, and their methods would influence German strategy for the remainder of the conflict. Their victory at Tannenberg showcased not only the importance of leadership, but also the power of intelligence, foresight, and the ability to turn the tide of war with decisive action. The Russians seemed unstoppable, that is, until they weren't. As the Russian army pushed deeper into German territory, they made critical strategic errors that would prove fatal. From poor communication to a lack of coordination among their commanders, this segment delves into the disastrous decisions that led to their encirclement and eventual destruction at Tannenberg. In the summer of 1914, the Russian army seemed poised to take advantage of the German focus on the Western Front. With their numerical superiority, the Russians believed they could push through East Prussia and deliver a decisive blow to the Germans. Initially, their advance was successful, and they quickly gained momentum, marching toward the heart of Germany. The soldiers were motivated, and their commanders, though inexperienced, were confident in the army's ability to overwhelm their foes. However, the Russian strategic overconfidence soon led to a series of disastrous mistakes that would set the stage for their defeat at the Battle of Tannenberg. One of the most critical errors the Russians made was their failure to coordinate their forces effectively. The Russian Second Army, led by General Alexander Samsonov, was tasked with advancing into East Prussia, while the First Army, commanded by Paul von Rennenkampf, was to advance from the opposite direction. Ideally, the two armies should have coordinated their movements to trap the Germans and create a pincer movement. However, the two commanders were at odds with one another, and a personal rivalry between them hampered their ability to work together. This lack of coordination meant that the Russians were not able to strike with the unity needed to overwhelm the German forces, who were more mobile and better coordinated. To make matters worse, communication between Russian headquarters and the front lines was inefficient and often unreliable. Messages were sent too slowly, and the lack of modern communication infrastructure meant that vital information didn't reach the commanders in a timely manner. As the Russian armies advanced, they lacked a clear understanding of the Germans' positions, and they were unable to react to the rapidly changing dynamics of the battlefield. This left them vulnerable to German counterattacks and ambushes. Adding to the Russian army's difficulties was the overextension of their supply lines. As they pushed deeper into East Prussia, their lines became stretched thin, and maintaining the flow of reinforcements, ammunition, and food became increasingly difficult. The Germans, under the leadership of Generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff, recognized this vulnerability and were able to exploit it. They launched a series of rapid attacks that caught the Russians off guard and forced them to abandon key positions. The Russians, unable to regroup effectively, found themselves out of position and open to a devastating German encirclement. The most fatal mistake came when the Russians failed to recognize the tactical danger of their exposed flanks. General Samsonov, focused on his own advance, failed to account for the risk of his forces becoming surrounded. The Germans, by moving quickly and utilizing their superior communication and command structure, were able to isolate Samsonov's forces from Rennenkampf's army, Once the Russians were split and cut off from their reinforcements, the Germans moved in with devastating force. The Russian Second Army was trapped, and the Germans executed a textbook encirclement, crushing the Russian forces. The result of these blunders was catastrophic. Over 90,000 Russian soldiers were taken prisoner, and thousands more were killed or wounded. The Russian commanders, having failed to communicate and coordinate effectively, were left with little recourse but to retreat. General Samsonov, devastated by the loss, took his own life, marking a tragic end to the battle. The Russians, who had initially seemed unstoppable, had suffered a humiliating defeat that would have profound consequences for the rest of the war. The defeat at Tannenberg was not just a military setback, it was a devastating blow to Russian morale. The failure to coordinate between commanders, the overextension of their forces, and the breakdown of communication left the Russian army in disarray. The battle demonstrated the importance of strategy, coordination, and the ability to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances on the battlefield. The Russians would have to learn from their mistakes, but the loss at Tannenberg was a harsh lesson, one that would affect their ability to continue the war effectively in the months and years that followed. It was a disaster that marked the beginning of a long period of setbacks for Russia on the Eastern Front. Imagine the chaos. The battle is raging, and the Russian forces are being slowly, but surely, surrounded. The Germans, with their superior tactics and knowledge of the terrain, move in to deliver a crushing blow. As the Russians scramble to reorganize, the sheer scale of the encirclement begins to take shape. The once confident Russian soldiers find themselves trapped in a deadly vice. The Battle of Tannenberg was a turning point for both the Russian and German forces in World War I, but it was the German tactics that would ultimately define the outcome of the battle. As the Germans executed their rapid counteroffensive, the Russian forces found themselves slowly but surely being hemmed in on all sides. What began as a conventional battle soon turned into a nightmarish scenario for the Russians, as their lines were pushed back and their positions became more vulnerable by the hour. The German strategy was as calculated as it was ruthless. Led by Generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff, the German commanders understood the crucial importance of seizing the initiative. They used their superior communication and coordination to create a strategy of encirclement, drawing the Russian forces into a trap they could not escape. The key to the success of the German plan was their ability to move quickly and decisively, exploiting weaknesses in the Russian command structure and stretching the Russian forces beyond their capacity to respond. At the heart of the Russian vulnerability was the lack of coordination between the two Russian armies. The Russian First Army, commanded by General Paul von Rennenkampf, and the Russian Second Army, commanded by General Alexander Samsonov, were intended to work in unison to trap the German forces. However, personal animosity between Rennenkampf and Samsonov led to a lack of communication and coordination between the two commanders. As the Germans attacked, Samsonov's forces found themselves isolated from Rennenkampf's support, and their flanks were exposed. The German forces, understanding the disarray in the Russian ranks, used this opportunity to attack. They struck hard at the weak points in the Russian position, using their superior artillery, fast-moving units, and knowledge of the terrain to gradually tighten the noose around the Russian forces. The encirclement was executed with precision. German forces surrounded Samsonov's army from the north, while additional German forces closed in from the south. In the middle of this chaos, Samsonov's troops were cut off from reinforcements and supply lines, and their ability to retreat was blocked. The scale of the encirclement became apparent as the battle raged on. The Russians, overwhelmed and disorganized, tried to regroup and make a stand, but their efforts were futile. With each passing hour, the ring around the Russian forces grew tighter. Desperation set in as soldiers who had once been full of confidence and determination now faced the grim reality of being trapped. The once proud Russian army, which had initially advanced with optimism, was now in full retreat, with their lines shattered and their commanders unable to coordinate a coherent response. The German forces were relentless. They methodically pushed in from all sides, forcing the Russian soldiers into a pocket from which there was no escape. As the encirclement tightened, the Russian morale began to collapse. Soldiers were exhausted, starving, and terrified. Many had no choice but to surrender or be captured, and the fighting became increasingly brutal as the Germans moved in to finish what had begun as a straightforward counterattack. By the end of the battle, the Russian Second Army had been decisively defeated. The Germans had inflicted a staggering defeat on the Russians, and the scale of the encirclement made the loss even more humiliating. The Russian forces, who had once believed they could march through East Prussia with ease, were left shattered and disillusioned, with their entire strategy collapsing in the face of a German maneuver that was as tactically brilliant as it was devastating. The encirclement at Tannenberg highlighted the importance of coordinated strategy and the devastating consequences of failing to communicate on the battlefield. The Germans, through their superior tactics and swift movements, not only secured a critical victory, but sent a clear message to the Russians: the war would not be won by numbers alone. The battle was a turning point for the Russian forces, whose confidence was shattered and morale broken, setting the stage for years of struggle on the Eastern Front. With the Russian forces nearly encircled, Hindenburg knew the time had come for his masterstroke. A counterattack so swift and so precise that it left the Russians reeling. This was the moment when the tide turned. The German army, once thought to be on the defensive, had struck back with deadly precision. The Russians, overwhelmed and outmaneuvered, were left to scramble for any hope of escape. The Battle of Tannenberg is often remembered as a triumph of German military strategy, and at the heart of this victory was General Paul von Hindenburg's brilliant counterattack. By the time the German forces had nearly completed their encirclement of the Russian Second Army, the Russian forces were trapped and disorganized, desperate for any way out. The encirclement had begun to take shape, and it was clear that the Russian forces, led by General Alexander Samsonov, were in dire straits. But it was the timing, coordination, and sheer tactical genius of Hindenburg's response that sealed the fate of the Russians and turned the battle into a crushing defeat for them. The Russians had long believed their numerical superiority would be enough to overpower the Germans. But as the battle unfolded, their forces found themselves being systematically outflanked and surrounded. General Hindenburg, aware of the importance of maintaining momentum, had already set his plan into motion. He recognized that, for all of the Russian strengths, their weaknesses were exposed, and it was only a matter of time before they cracked under pressure. But rather than waiting for the Russian forces to disintegrate on their own, Hindenburg launched a daring and bold counterattack that would forever change the course of the battle. The key to Hindenburg's strategy was his understanding of timing and precision. He had studied the battlefield extensively and knew that the Russians were vulnerable at certain points. The Germans, with their superior communication and mobility, were able to adapt quickly to the changing battlefield. The Russian forces, on the other hand, lacked this flexibility, and their command structure was plagued by inefficiency. As Hindenburg's forces struck with sudden force, the Russians were caught off guard, unable to react with the same speed and precision. Hindenburg had divided his forces, allowing them to strike from multiple angles simultaneously. The Germans, having outflanked the Russians, moved in on the weak points of their lines, pushing the Russians into a tight pocket. This quick, decisive action threw the Russian forces into disarray. They could no longer coordinate an effective defense or retreat in an orderly manner. Instead, they were forced to scramble, retreating under pressure from all sides. The Germans' use of artillery, infantry, and cavalry in perfect synchronization made it impossible for the Russians to mount any significant resistance. Hindenburg's brilliant maneuver forced the Russian Second Army into a dire situation. The Russians were not only faced with the daunting challenge of escaping the encirclement, but they were also running out of resources and time. Supplies were cut off, reinforcements failed to arrive, and the leadership of General Samsonov was questioned. Without a clear direction and facing overwhelming German pressure, the Russian soldiers had no choice but to surrender or face certain annihilation. As the Germans continued their relentless advance, the Russian forces were forced to fall back further and further. The Russian command suffered irreparable damage, and General Samsonov, unable to cope with the defeat, took his own life. The Battle of Tannenberg marked a turning point in the war, and Hindenburg's counterattack was the pivotal moment that led to the German victory. Not only did it secure a crucial strategic position for the Germans, but it also shattered the Russian illusion of invincibility. Hindenburg's success at Tannenberg catapulted him into the national spotlight and cemented his reputation as one of Germany's greatest military minds. The battle also marked the beginning of a prolonged period of German dominance on the Eastern Front. The Russian defeat at Tannenberg had profound consequences for the rest of World War I. The Russians were forced to regroup, and their morale was severely damaged. Hindenburg and Ludendorff's swift counterattack had turned the tide in favor of the Germans, setting the stage for further offensives on the Eastern Front. Tannenberg would go down in history not only as a tactical triumph but also as a demonstration of the importance of precision, timing, and adaptability in modern warfare. The German victory was a testament to the brilliance of Hindenburg's leadership and the devastating impact of a well-executed counteroffensive. The aftermath of Tannenberg wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The Russian soldiers, who had once been so sure of their victory, were left devastated. The crushing defeat at Tannenberg shattered their morale, and the psychological scars would linger long after the battle was over. This segment explores how the loss of confidence in their leadership and the horrors of defeat began to weigh heavily on the Russian army. The Battle of Tannenberg left an indelible mark on the Russian military, one that went beyond the immediate loss of life and territory. It was a psychological blow that reverberated throughout the Russian forces, devastating their morale and causing long-term damage to their fighting spirit. Before the battle, the Russian army had entered East Prussia with high hopes. They were confident that their numerical superiority would overwhelm the Germans and that their advance would be unstoppable. But the brutal defeat at Tannenberg shattered that illusion, leaving the Russian soldiers disillusioned and demoralized. The loss of confidence in their leadership was one of the most significant psychological impacts on the Russian forces. General Alexander Samsonov, who had been commanding the Russian Second Army, bore the brunt of the blame for the catastrophic failure. His inability to coordinate effectively with General Paul von Rennenkampf and his failure to act decisively in the face of the German counteroffensive left the Russian army vulnerable. Samsonov's apparent lack of leadership and the disarray among his troops contributed heavily to their defeat. The soldiers, who had once looked to their leaders for guidance, now found themselves questioning their decisions and abilities. Many felt abandoned by their commanders, and that sense of betrayal left a lasting psychological scar on the Russian army. In the wake of Tannenberg, the Russian soldiers were faced not only with the immediate consequences of defeat casualties, prisoners, and the collapse of their front lines, but with the haunting realization that they had been outclassed by the Germans. This realization was compounded by the shame of surrender. Over 90,000 Russian soldiers were captured, and the once proud Russian army found itself humiliated on the battlefield. The soldiers' spirits were crushed as they were forced to lay down their weapons and endure the long journey as prisoners of war. The loss at Tannenberg was more than just a military defeat. It was a symbol of failure that damaged the pride of the Russian army and the morale of its soldiers for the rest of the war. The psychological impact of Tannenberg also affected the Russian populace. News of the crushing defeat spread quickly, and the Russian people, who had initially rallied behind the war effort, began to lose faith in their leaders and military command. The defeat at Tannenberg was a powerful blow to national morale, and it set the stage for further disillusionment in Russia. The Russian army's loss at Tannenberg would prove to be a key factor in the eventual collapse of the Russian war effort. and it would contribute to the revolutionary sentiment that would later sweep through Russia in 1917. The mental toll on the Russian soldiers extended far beyond the battlefield. Many men, once filled with a sense of duty and pride, were now scarred by the experience of defeat. The fear of further humiliation weighed heavily on them. And as the war continued, this psychological damage eroded their will to fight. The Germans, on the other hand, capitalized on the Russians' mental and emotional collapse, and the psychological advantage they gained in the aftermath of Tannenberg would shape the rest of the war on the Eastern Front. In summary, the defeat at Tannenberg was not only a loss of territory and manpower for Russia, but a devastating psychological blow. The shattered morale of the Russian soldiers, the breakdown of trust in their leadership, and the emotional toll of the battle would affect their ability to continue the war. The psychological scars left by Tannenberg would linger long after the guns fell silent, and the Russian army would never fully recover from the trauma of that defeat. The German victory at Tannenberg wasn't just a win, it was a turning point. It not only solidified Hindenburg's reputation, but also ensured that Germany would maintain control of the Eastern Front for the foreseeable future. In this segment, we explore the significance of the German triumph and how it set the stage for further victories and the eventual stalemate on the Western Front. The Battle of Tannenberg was more than just a tactical victory. It was a strategic triumph that reshaped the dynamics of World War I, particularly on the Eastern Front. Prior to the battle, the Russian forces had gained significant ground in East Prussia, raising concerns in Germany about the vulnerability of its borders. However, the swift and decisive German counteroffensive not only halted the Russian advance, but also undermined Russian military power and shattered any illusions the Russians had about easily overpowering the Germans. Hindenburg and Ludendorff's brilliance in executing the battle plans would have lasting effects on the course of the war. The German army's rapid, coordinated strikes were executed with precision, exploiting Russian vulnerabilities in leadership and logistics. The Russian forces, stretched thin and unable to coordinate effectively, had made critical strategic errors, most notably in their failure to anticipate the German encirclement. General Alexander Samsonov's army, despite initial success, found itself trapped by German maneuver warfare, which was quickly evolving into a defining feature of modern conflict. What made this victory even more significant was the psychological impact it had on both the Germans and the Russians. For the Germans, Tannenberg was a powerful morale booster. After months of uncertainty and the initial setbacks they faced on the Western Front, this victory was a statement of strength, demonstrating that they could still outthink and outmaneuver their enemies. Hindenburg and Ludendorff were not only hailed as heroes, but their success elevated them to the highest echelons of military leadership, with their influence spreading across the entire German command structure. On the Russian side, the consequences of the defeat were profound. The collapse of the Russian Second Army not only demonstrated the inadequacies of their command, but also exposed weaknesses in their communication systems and the inability to mount a coherent defense when under pressure. The battle revealed how poor coordination between Russian commanders, coupled with outdated tactics, contributed to their downfall. Despite the initial optimism surrounding their advance, the Russians were now forced to contend with the realization that their forces were not as invincible as they had believed. The German victory at Tannenberg also secured control of East Prussia for Germany, which allowed them to refocus efforts on the Western Front. While the Western Front became bogged down in trench warfare, the Eastern Front was still fluid, and Germany now had an opportunity to apply greater pressure on the Russians without worrying about an imminent threat to their homeland. This victory also exposed the frailties in Russia's military leadership, causing a ripple effect that would play out over the next few years. Strategically, the victory at Tannenberg marked the end of Russian offensives in the region and allowed Germany to consolidate its position. Hindenburg's ability to exploit the Russians' overextended lines became a textbook example of effective command and control. The German forces, now with their victory at Tannenberg, not only ensured their hold over East Prussia, but also gained a psychological edge over the Russians, who would struggle to recover from the battle's aftermath. This victory shifted the momentum in the Eastern Front, allowing the Germans to confidently focus on further campaigns. In the wider context of the war, Tannenberg demonstrated the importance of leadership, innovation, and adaptability in modern warfare. The tactical genius displayed by Hindenburg and Ludendorff would set the tone for future German operations, particularly as the war shifted into a longer, more brutal struggle. Their success in the East provided the German military with the breathing room it needed to maintain its defense, and contributed to the growing legend of Hindenburg, whose leadership would become synonymous with German resilience throughout the war. With the Germans in full pursuit, the Russian army was forced to retreat. What should have been a strategic withdrawal became a chaotic scramble for survival. The Russian soldiers, defeated and demoralized, fled in disarray, leaving behind equipment, weapons, and the remnants of their once formidable force. This segment paints a vivid picture of the frantic retreat that followed the collapse of the Russian forces at Tannenberg. After the crushing defeat at the Battle of Tannenberg, the Russian army found itself in a precarious and demoralizing position. What had initially been a well-organized advance into German territory had turned into a humiliating retreat characterized by panic, disarray, and disorganization. The Russian forces, already struggling with internal communication breakdowns and poor coordination, were now faced with a full-scale retreat where survival took precedence over strategy. With the German forces closing in, the retreat became a desperate scramble to escape encirclement and avoid complete annihilation. The chaos of the withdrawal was compounded by the fact that many Russian soldiers had not been properly prepared for a retreat of this magnitude. There was no clear plan or leadership to guide them through the retreat, leaving the soldiers to fend for themselves. As a result, they left behind vital equipment, weapons, and supplies in their haste to flee the advancing Germans. The once mighty Russian Second Army, now fractured and vulnerable, was no longer the cohesive force it had been before Tannenberg. What had been a well-coordinated fighting force just days earlier was now reduced to a broken, demoralized group, unable to mount any serious resistance. The loss of command structure and discipline during the retreat further exacerbated the chaos. Officers, unable to maintain control over their troops, found themselves helpless as the soldiers fled in different directions. The lack of effective communication between various Russian units meant that no coordinated defense or counterattack could be mounted. Soldiers, exhausted and terrified, scattered, leaving gaps in their lines that were quickly exploited by the Germans. The Germans, well prepared and determined, pursued relentlessly, adding to the sense of panic and hopelessness among the retreating Russian forces. As they retreated, many Russian soldiers began to desert their posts, overwhelmed by the scale of their defeat and the harsh conditions of the retreat. The once confident Russian military had now become a shell of its former self. Soldiers, burdened by the weight of failure and defeat, discarded their equipment to lighten their load, leaving behind weapons, ammunition, and artillery. The lack of proper supplies also meant that many soldiers were forced to ration their food, further lowering morale and making it even harder to continue the retreat. The chaos was compounded by the harsh weather conditions that made the retreat even more difficult, as the soldiers struggled against rain, mud, and cold. This chaotic retreat marked a psychological turning point for the Russian army. Their defeat at Tannenberg was not just a loss of men and material, but a blow to their pride and confidence. The once formidable Russian army was now deeply fractured, and the retreat through East Prussia became a symbol of the collapse of their early war efforts. For the Russians, it was not just about retreating from the battlefield, it was a desperate attempt to survive, to escape further destruction, and to regroup after a devastating loss. The retreat, though desperate, was not the end of the Russian war effort, but it certainly marked a shift in the momentum of the war. The psychological and physical toll on the Russian forces would have long-lasting effects, and it would take years for the Russians to fully recover from the devastation they suffered at Tannenberg. The chaotic withdrawal set the stage for a long and painful period of instability on the Eastern Front, where the Germans would continue to hold the advantage, and the Russians would struggle to maintain any semblance of organized resistance. After the battle, the Russian army was broken, and the Germans stood victorious. But the cost was high on both sides. While the Germans emerged victorious, the battle marked the beginning of a long, grueling war that would take its toll on everyone involved. In this segment, we examine the long-term effects of Tannenberg on the Russian and German forces, as well as the broader implications for the war. The Battle of Tannenberg was a decisive moment in World War I, but it also marked the beginning of a much larger struggle. Though the Germans celebrated their victory, the cost of the battle, both in terms of lives lost and the strategic ramifications, was profound. For the Russians, the defeat at Tannenberg was a humiliation that shook their military confidence and disrupted their command structure. For the Germans, the victory was not the decisive end they had hoped for, but the beginning of a protracted conflict that would see them fighting on multiple fronts for years. In the immediate aftermath of Tannenberg, the German forces found themselves in a relatively strong position on the Eastern Front. The Russian Second Army had been utterly defeated, and the Germans were able to secure East Prussia. The psychological impact of this victory was significant. It solidified the reputations of Hindenburg and Ludendorff, who became national heroes and were subsequently promoted to more influential positions in the German military. The victory gave the Germans a much-needed morale boost, reinforcing their belief in the superiority of their tactics, leadership, and strategy. However, while the immediate success at Tannenberg seemed like a game-changer, the long-term implications for Germany were far less clear. The Germans had secured an important victory, but they had also overextended themselves. The logistical demands of maintaining an extended front, especially in the face of continued Russian mobilization, meant that Germany would need to maintain a massive presence on the Eastern Front for years to come. The cost of holding the territory gained at Tannenberg, along with the resources required for sustained operations, became a burden that would weigh on Germany as the war dragged on. The victory, while important, did not end the war or ensure a swift German victory, and Germany would soon find itself locked in a bitter struggle with no clear end in sight. For the Russian army, the defeat at Tannenberg had devastating consequences. The loss of such a large and well-equipped army severely hindered Russia's military capabilities. Not only was their command structure fractured, but their reputation was also deeply tarnished. Russia's internal stability, already fragile due to political unrest and economic strain, was further compromised by the scale of the defeat. Public confidence in the leadership of Tsar Nicholas II and the competence of the military was severely undermined. While Russia remained in the war, the battle left them vulnerable, and they would struggle to mount significant offensives in the coming years. The broader implications of the battle were felt across the entire theater of war. Tannenberg showed that no side was guaranteed victory and that the war would be a long, drawn-out affair. The Germans, having faced significant casualties, now understood that the war would not be won by a few decisive battles, but through a sustained and exhausting campaign. Similarly, for the Russians, Tannenberg underscored the necessity of modernization and unity in their military leadership. The effects of Tannenberg were not confined to the immediate aftermath. The battle's psychological and strategic impact would shape both armies' decisions in the years to come. For the Germans, the victory did not guarantee a swift end to the war, but signaled a longer and more grueling conflict ahead. For the Russians, the defeat marked the beginning of a protracted struggle that would eventually weaken their resolve and contribute to the collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917. The war, for both nations, was only just beginning, and the legacy of Tannenberg would echo throughout the course of World War I. Tannenberg wasn't just a battle, it was a defining moment in World War I. The consequences of the German victory at Tannenberg rippled throughout the rest of the war, altering the strategic landscape of the Eastern Front. In this final segment, we reflect on the lasting legacy of Tannenberg, how it shaped the course of the war, and how the world would never be the same after that fateful encounter. The Battle of Tannenberg in 1914 was more than just a military clash. It was a pivotal moment that changed the entire trajectory of World War I. The German victory not only eliminated the Russian threat in East Prussia, but also shifted the balance of power on the Eastern Front, creating long-lasting effects that would shape military strategy for the rest of the war. Tannenberg demonstrated that tactics, timing, and intelligence were far more decisive than sheer numbers, proving that commanders who understood the battlefield could win against overwhelming odds. This battle would become a symbol of the growing importance of modern military coordination and the profound psychological effects a victory could have on both sides. For the Germans, the victory at Tannenberg gave them strategic superiority in the East. With the Russian Second Army crushed, Germany could now focus its efforts on the Western Front, where the war had bogged down in trench warfare. The victory at Tannenberg secured East Prussia for Germany and ensured that Russia would not be able to launch a successful offensive in the region for the foreseeable future. But more than that, the battle revealed the vulnerabilities of the Russian military. The Germans, particularly under Hindenburg and Ludendorff, used flanking maneuvers and superior coordination to outpace and outwit the Russians. The lessons learned at Tannenberg would influence German strategy for the rest of the war, as the Germans would continue to rely on speed, precision, and encirclement tactics in their future campaigns. Psychological impact of Tannenberg on Russia was equally profound. The destruction of the Russian Second Army marked the beginning of a series of humiliating setbacks for Russia, which struggled to regain its strength in the aftermath. The defeat exposed Russia's logistical and command weaknesses, which led to significant morale issues within the Russian military and civilian population. Russian leadership, particularly Tsar Nicholas II, was severely criticized, and the failure at Tannenberg would be a contributing factor to the Russian Revolution in 1917. The loss of confidence in Russia's ability to secure victory in the war would lead to a re-evaluation of their role in the conflict. On a broader scale, Tannenberg altered the Eastern Front dynamics and affected the Allied war effort. While the Germans now had the upper hand in the East, it allowed the Allies to concentrate their resources and efforts on the Western Front. The battle also highlighted the importance of alliance coordination, as the French and British support for Russia would ultimately play a critical role in the war's outcome. Finally, the legacy of Tannenberg lies in its lessons about the evolving nature of warfare. This battle showcased the shift from traditional, massive armies engaging in set-piece battles to the more fluid, tactical warfare of the 20th century. The importance of logistics, intelligence, and psychological warfare was clearer than ever. Tannenberg foreshadowed the modern battlefield, where a well-executed plan could destroy an opponent's will to fight faster than brute force could win a war. Tannenberg did not just alter the course of World War I. It was a lesson in the complexities of modern warfare that influenced military strategy for generations. The reverberations of that battle are still felt today in military academies and strategy discussions, making it a defining moment in military history.